We're going to try and do something tonight that is difficult to do, and that's to cover an awful lot of territory in very short order. Not only that, we're going to do it as a tag team, which is even more interesting. We've never tried this before, so it's an experiment, but I think it's one that might produce some interesting connections. After we're finished with our presentations, each one will be about 30 minutes. Then we'll have a question and answer period, and you can ask us all kinds of questions, and we'll, I hope at least, be able to answer some of them. My section is the earliest for non-native people around the world coming to Oregon, or at least trying to come to Oregon. It's a very long period, and yet it's in some ways a short period, especially if you consider the length of time that indigenous people lived in Oregon. So it's 1741 to 1841, only a century, but it does include an awful lot of activity. Here's a list. There's no quiz, by the way, at the end of this. Here's a list of the explorations, and I just want you to take a look at them briefly. You don't need to memorize them or anything of that sort, but these are the ones I'm going to touch on. I'm not going to mention something about every single one of them or go into any great detail except in general subjects. But take a look at not only the names of the people, some of them you will recognize immediately, some you may not have ever heard of, and that they're maritime. So I've got sea and land, and I also have the sponsoring nation, and I also have whether or not it's government or private. And by private, I mean trading for the most part. So these explorations, sea and land, are part of something that historians have called the second great age of exploration. And that really entails mostly beginning in the late 17th century, but really dominantly in the 18th and 19th centuries. In other words, the period of the Enlightenment. And that's extremely important for understanding what happened, because the Enlightenment is driven by a thirst for knowledge of all things, and driven also by the certainty that if we understand through science the world, we get closer to God, and we certainly understand our lives better. So there's a thirst for knowledge, there's a development of technology, and most importantly, I think, and this is something we ought to think about as we go through the rest of this course, there's a hubris in this, a human, optimistic, ambitious thrust that sends nations and people out across the globe. And this effort is an effort that is analogous to going into space, because they're riding on some of the most technologically advanced pieces of equipment ever built by human beings. And these are the ocean-going, deep-water sailing machines that did things that are just incredible when we think about them, especially anybody who goes on a cruise today. Here's an image from 1593, which is the earliest approximation by a chart maker, by a map maker of the northwest coast of North America. It's one of the last places that was really investigated in any detail. And in fact, as you can see from one of the names on the chart, Anian, up there in the left-hand corner, it's part of a dream. And the dream is the ability to go from the two great oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific, by essentially cutting through this great continental mass of North America. In school, you probably heard about it as the Northwest Passage, but it was also called the Strait of Anian. And it was a dream because it was propelled, as so many of our advances are, by the hope of some kind of improvement, some sort of gain, some sort of maybe even trick on nature. We live through this all the time. It's not something that only happened after the Enlightenment, and it's not something that happened only in our modern time, but it's part of the human condition in some ways. And that's something I want you to think about as we go through these examples, and also when we talk about the fur trade later tonight. And that is that Oregon is a defined place. We know exactly what it is. We can look at it on the map. But it's connected to the world. And I think even more importantly, it's connected to the desires of the human community, however we might want to define that, and the people who come into contact with Oregon, and the fact that they change it in some way and are changed by it. So some of these people I'm going to talk about hardly even see Oregon. But what's interesting is that what they discover has profound impact on Oregon. So that's how I want you to think about this. First, it's transnational. Second, it's in the Enlightenment, and therefore it's driven by this desire to know everything and to pursue science. And that what happens in the process of all of these discoveries comes to have an effect on Oregon. And in some ways, Oregon, especially when we start talking about the fur trade, is going to have an effect on the rest of the world. As the title says, this is the northwest coast before James Cook. You'll find out a little bit more about him in a minute. And this is an example of cartography at a time when cartography, along with many other of the sciences, tries to imagine places and things and people that haven't been seen by anyone, or takes what has been seen by somebody else and molds it to their own desires. There isn't a map made at any time in history or today that isn't a projection of an ambition, a hope, an idea. It's imaginative. It's always biased. It always has an agenda. There are no exceptions to this, even though some of these may be slight. Even your highway map includes these built-in properties. It's just something that can't be escaped. In the case of these maps, like the one projected up here, they're bits and pieces of information. Some of it is observed and some of it is not. Some of it is passed on 3 or 4 times. Some of it comes directly from, as I said, people who have observed it but written it down in a way that will please the people who sponsored them. Some of the best examples of that are Columbus himself. And in this case, one of the points that's interesting on this map is the big cut down near the bottom, near the letter N. And that's the River of the West. This is based on a discovery, purported discovery in 1604 by a Spanish mariner of a great river of the West. This is, in essence, the Columbia River. Because this River of the West, which will continue to play itself out even in the word Oregon, at least by some accounts, is the notion that there is a river that drains the west, that empties into the Southern Sea, the Pacific Ocean, and this is the first depiction of it on a map. It will move north, of course, quite a ways. This is depicting it about 41 degrees, in other words, just south of the Oregon, California state line. But here's the man. There isn't anyone that I can think of who stands taller, broader, with more impact than James Cook, not just in British maritime history, which he is absolutely the most important person, but worldwide. Because the French and the Spanish both launch expeditions after his that are essentially trying to mimic his great Pacific voyages. There were 3 of them, and the last one is the most important. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But Cook's approach was so purely Enlightenment driven, and he was such a master mariner in the ability to control his place, his ships, his destiny almost, that he set a standard that was revered and emulated by would-be explorers all over Western Europe. The Comte de la Pérouse and Alejandro Malaspina are 2 of the most important. They both admitted to themselves, to their sponsors, and in fact, even to the British, their rivals in some ways, that they wanted to be another James Cook. Now, Cook had 3 voyages, and the last one's the most important because this is the one where he charts out the Northwest coast. What's he looking for? Well, he's looking for almost anything that these Enlightenment maritime explorers wanted, which was new lands, new people, new resources, and maybe, just maybe, empire. I want to put maybe empire at the end, not because it's not important, but because it's driven by these people so strongly in a nationalistic way in many respects, to learn that much of what they were doing was actually bringing that world back to their countries. Any of you ever been to England, ever been to Kew Gardens, for example? Anybody here? Somebody here probably has. It's a product of this. They brought the world back to their place, to Holland, to France, to Spain, to England. Here's Cook's Northwest coast. We could go into detail on this one map and spend 3 or 4 hours and just barely scratch the surface of what this map is doing. But I want to point out a couple of things about this map. One is that it's detailed and it's showing you where and how the shape of the sea and the land together create an environment and opportunity, yes, but also new places for discovery. So that's one thing it's doing. The second thing it's doing is it's eliminating almost entirely the existence of this Northwest Passage I mentioned earlier, this mythic and hoped for water route through North America. But in the process of doing this, Cook had to overcome many, many things. And one of the things he had to overcome was the limitation of how you actually spent months or years on a ship. Now, he didn't do this by himself, but he raised it to a new level, to a level that hadn't been seen before. And 2 of the things that he had at his disposal and he created made the greatest difference. The first one is he was able to determine where he was by virtue of having a maritime chronometer, a clock, so that he could tell how far west or how far east or any distance from a known point on the ocean. We haven't got time to go through all of this, but know that that's an important thing to know, where you were. He could always figure out where you were on latitude, but longitude, that was harder. The second thing he was able to do was he was able to figure out how to solve the most dangerous condition at sea. And the most dangerous condition at sea was scurvy, which is the lack, essentially, of ascorbic acid in your body, which could be fixed or remedied by fresh vegetables and by citrus fruits. This is the origin, some of you already know, of the British being called limeys, because they had limes and citrus fruit that they carried on their ships. But these ships were just incredible. I wish I could go into more detail about them, but just imagine a ship in which it's completely self-contained, including animals, including enough timber inside the ship to build another ship, not as large, but another ship, or 2. 150, 200 men on the ship, depending upon its size. It's just amazing what they were able to do, and also the courage it took to do it. There's no Houston, we have a problem. Cook himself, unfortunately, in 1779, meets a fate that could have happened to any of them. He's murdered on the beach in Hawaii. And that story itself is an intriguing one. Cultural anthropologists are still arguing about it, and they'll be arguing about it long after all of us in this room have passed on. It's quite an interesting story, but the point about it is European Enlightenment culture meeting non-enlightened, is that a right term? I don't think so. Meeting a culture that sees enchantment in practically everything on Earth. Not an easy combination. So he dies in 1779, but, whoop, what happened? I hit something too long, just a second. Yeah. Okay, there's Cook's Northwest Coast map. Here's Comte de la Pérouse, his map of the Northwest Coast in 1786. Now between 1779, Cook's death, and 1786 when La Pérouse does this map, his voyage begins in 1785. Pérouse, by the way, gets lost in the South Pacific. It takes a couple of decades before they find out what happened to him. So here's another perilous loss. Although his maps and such had been sent back because it was a multi-year voyage, sent back to Paris, so we have all of his charts, you can see that it's filling in a little bit more than what Cook had. And here's the Northwest Coast after Cook, showing other information. Now, this other information comes from a completely different source. It comes from a bunch of traders, because one of the things that happens when Cook goes to the Northwest Coast is his men trade, especially metal, for furs, for pelagic furs. That's furs on animals that are in the sea. And they take them on their way back to England, because these are circumnavigations, and they stop in China, and woe and behold, my God, could they get money for these furs. Some of the furs brought, and this is hard to believe, but it's true, 1,500% return. Can you imagine what happened next? Yeah, a rush to the Northwest Coast for soft gold, for furs. And that information ends up on these charts as well. So this is what we know after Cook. The next great figure in understanding what this is all about is George Vancouver. Here's a man born in King's Lynn on the Ouse in England, in Norfolk. Son of a customs agent, in love with the sea. He makes his first junior, almost like non-commissioned officer rating at age 12. By 14, he's climbed the ladder up 2 or 3 notches, and he's working for the captain of the ship. And he's on Cook's third voyage. So is William Bligh, by the way. And by the way, both George Vancouver and William Bligh are some of the greatest of all of the mariner chart makers and navigators that we know of. Absolutely incredible. Read about Bligh's practically solitary post-mutiny boat travel if you want to read a harrowing story, and there are several recent books on that. Anyway, back to Vancouver. Vancouver is charged with something that's quite difficult. That is, to be the great Enlightenment-driven, scientific, exploratory mariner, while at the same time carrying the water of England in a dispute with Spain over the claimed possession of a beautiful port on the western side of Vancouver Island, far up on the northwest coast. But Vancouver's real powerful, almost overwhelming contribution is this. Whoops, if I hit that button again. Now this is a unfortunately poor rendition because this map is quite large. But I'm showing you the coast of Washington and the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Can you see that back there fairly well, or is it just too fuzzy? It's hard to read because this is done in a yellow color with a relatively faint dark markings for the various places. You can see the Columbia River down near the bottom, and as you go up you can see the opening to Puget Sound. He will, with his men, chart every mile of coastline from essentially the California-Oregon border all the way up to the Gulf of Alaska. It will take them 3 seasons in 3 years, so 3 summer seasons over 3 years to do this. The voyage lasted from 1791 to 1795. And he did it by using the most advanced instruments that were available, including this one, which is an instrument maker by the name of Arnold in London, making a copy of the 4th chronometer made by the great John Harrison, who solved the problem of how to have a clock on a pitching and rolling ship that could keep time. You can't have a pendulum clock on a ship, can you? And you also have to worry about things like changes in temperature and all manner of things. Well, this one, which is in the British Museum right now, is the clock he carried. And with that, plus the other devices he used, they would set up a big observatory tent on land and use small boats and do triangulations to determine exactly the location of every single knob and every single inlet and all the rest, to produce a chart in which you could take a rowboat and go up and down Puget Sound and clear up to the Gulf of Alaska and know exactly where you are. You could do it today with his map, done in the 1790s. Absolutely fantastic. This experience with Vancouver wasn't just about enlightenment in the sense of learning about the place and applying all of the science and technology. It was also about meeting the people and determining what was of value there. Remember that Cook had already, and his men, even though Cook didn't realize it because he was killed in Hawaii, his men made all of this money by virtue of taking these furs to China, and everybody then rushed to it. So everybody knew about resources, but exactly how many resources, what kind of resources, and how can we get them? How can we trade? Here's a depiction by an artist of the Discovery and the Chatham, the 2 ships that were the expedition in Puget Sound. And here's the person that, although he met many native people, this individual, McKenna, is probably the most interesting and the most important for Vancouver. He is chief of a band of Mwachet, and they lived in the area that was assigned the name by mariners as Nootka Sound or Friendly Cove on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And his role, not unlike the role of Chinook people, for example, at the mouth of the Columbia, to control access to all manner of trade. And Vancouver knew that if he was going to make any kind of progress, he had to do something with this person. And so in the company of a rival nation, the Spanish, this is a artist's rendition of a sketch done at the scene of McKenna's lodge at Tassis, on an inlet that essentially emptied into Nootka Sound, where McKenna, who is depicted here in the cape doing a dance, is essentially telling Vancouver and the Spanish captain and the entourage, European entourage, that he's in charge not only of the place, but he's also in charge of their access to the place. And what does he get out of it? He gets out of it the prestige of having control over the Europeans coming to people that live in his place. This is a complicated relationship. This is a kind of relationship that's going to change Oregon. It'll change it later with fur trade. Robert Gray's sketch of the mouth of the Columbia. Some of you have heard this story, but it's worth telling again. Gray doesn't know that there's a river there. The river had been first noted on a chart by Bruno Heceta, who was a Spanish mariner. But the Spanish were keeping all of their charts to themselves because the Spanish were trying to defend what they considered to be their ocean. And so the actual knowledge of this place, which Heceta drew out in 1775, was not known to Cook, and it wasn't known to Vancouver. Cook, when he came up the Oregon coast, had been blown off the coast. He names Cape Foulweather for good reason, and never sees any of this. And so Gray, in coasting up the river, he's an American trader. He's not an explorer. He's not after science. He has no interest in that at all. He's interested in only one thing, and that's getting a return for the people who paid for the ship in Boston and his portion of it. He bumps into Vancouver up in Nootka Sound and says, you know, I saw that opening down about 49 degrees or about 46 degrees, and I think that there's a river there. And Vancouver says, no, there isn't a river there. We went by there. That's not a river. We looked, and there's nothing there. Oh, I think there is. He goes back down, trading, mind you. He's not going just to try and find the river. And in May of 1792, he crosses the bar, weighs anchor, ends up with a trading episode with natives in the mouth, goes back out and goes on his way, continuing his trading, and has a meeting with a Spanish captain in which he says, with this chart, says, there is a river down there. When you see Vancouver, give it to him. He gives him the chart. The Spanish captain has dinner with Vancouver later, gives it to Vancouver, and Vancouver is, my God, he's right. There is something down there. And so in October of 1792, William Broughton, lieutenant, who is the captain of the Chatham, under Vancouver's captaincy, crosses the bar, lowers down 2 longboats, and rows up the Columbia River 100 miles, and does this chart, which is in 2 sections. You can see the bottom section is the mouth of the Columbia going up, and then once you get to the top of the bottom section, you go to the top, to the bottom of the top section. You can go all the way up and see where he ends up at Point Vancouver, which is not too far from present-day Washougal. Here's an interesting piece of trivia. He never sees and he never understands that there's a Columbia River Gorge. He thinks, and this is a mariner's eye, he thinks that the Columbia River begins somewhere near Mount Hood. In other words, we can make some mistakes, even guys who know what they're doing. Now we'll switch to land. Everybody knows this story, and I'm not going to attempt to tell the whole story. We're only going to talk about the story that has something to do with Oregon. Thomas Jefferson, we all recognize as some would say, as President Kennedy said, perhaps the brainiest president we've ever had. But he had an ambition, and the ambition, of course, before he was president, was to explore the western portion of the North American continent for various reasons, most of them driven by science. He ends up with Meriwether Lewis, who is his private secretary, who was brought on as a private secretary, by the way, to reduce the size of the army. What a great task. But ends up being a person who is also driven by the same ambition. He calls it this is a paraphrase, but my glorious idea, my glorious passion, something like that. I can't remember the exact words, but he's bitten by it just like Thomas Jefferson. And his fellow army officer, William Clark. And so under the auspices of the U.S. Army, that's very important to remember, it's a military expedition, the Lewis and Clark expedition is begun in its preparation in the late winter of 1803. But in the spring of 1803, unbeknownst to Thomas Jefferson, a deal is made, as we all know, between the United States and France to get this enormous territory, so-called Louisiana Purchase. So in November of 1803, and this is an important small item, Jefferson has to change his letter of instructions to tell Lewis and Clark that when you're on the Missouri River, by the way, tell the natives that you're in charge, not the British, not the French, not the Spanish, the U.S., we own it. But once they cross out of that Louisiana territory, which is on the spine of the Continental Divide, and they drop down into the Columbia River basin, the drainage that ends up running right out past Astoria, they are into something entirely different. So everything that happens on the west side of the Continental Divide, everything that happens in present-day Idaho, Oregon, western Montana, and Washington, all of that stuff that happens to Lewis and Clark happens in territory that has nothing to do with the United States. Nothing. Unfortunately, we forget that. We think, oh, well, that's ours, because we know what happens next. We know what develops. But the fact is, they didn't. And they had to change their entire attitude about what they were doing. But more important than that is that they came into a landscape that they didn't understand, and one that they didn't anticipate. So we have to pause here for a moment for one small lesson, and that is exploration and discovery are not the same thing. Exploration is going out to find something that you already have an idea. Remember those maps that had rivers and places on them? You already have an idea of what it is. It's like taking a picture postcard of, we were just there, actually not too long ago, the Alhambra, and saying, oh, I know what that looks like. You go there and you see exactly what the postcard told you to look at. A discovery is different. A discovery is something that you didn't expect, something that's new, shocking perhaps, small maybe, but something you didn't expect. So what Lewis and Clark get in their expedition is both an exploration, things that they knew they were going to see, and discovery, things that they had no idea that they were going to see. They didn't know they were going to see a condor. They had no idea what sturgeon were like. They certainly didn't know what Pacific salmon were like. You know, they turned down salmon up the river and bought dogs instead. I don't know about you, but I think that's kind of an odd choice. So they learned a great deal on their way. And that's their path. Almost all of us are familiar with it because we've seen it so many times. From the St. Louis area in the Mississippi Valley all the way clear to the Pacific and back, with adventures and discoveries and all kinds of activities that many of us have heard stories about. I'll be happy to answer any questions about this in our Q&A, but suffice to say that what Lewis and Clark end up exploring and discovering is a national event of enormous significance because of its success, number one, and number two, because it gave Americans a picture, some of it mixed, of what North America had to offer. it will be decades before they'll do anything with it, that is, Americans. But the point is that what they brought back, and more than 1 million words written about it by themselves, is the most extensive exploration in American history. There's nothing that comes close to it. And maps such as the Great Falls of the Columbia, or the mouth of the Willamette. This one informed in large measure by native information and observations. These are sketch maps that were made by Clark principally, and then they were later rendered by Clark into more formal maps. So the maps themselves are a kind of a composite. In fact, in some cases, you can see Clark actually making adjustments based upon information that he receives after he made the original sketch map. And then Clark's great map, 1810, that really shows what they thought this great territory looked like. They made a lot of mistakes in this map, by the way, ones that would be corrected later on. But the point is that it conveyed in a map something very, very powerful. And if you look at it closely, you'll see that Oregon becomes not impenetrable, but not welcoming at all. They did their best to describe the Columbia River as a place that was welcoming, but you didn't have to read much between the lines to realize that they hated it. They detested it. From the weather, to the people, to the rapids. And interestingly, where were most of the rapids? On today's present lower Snake River. Not a place you would normally think of. David Thompson's map, 1812, shows much the same thing. I'm running out of time, and so I'm going to give you 2 or 3 examples of other explorations with a little bit of a description of it, and then turn this over to Greg, otherwise you won't get the fur trade. David Thompson, Hudson's Bay Company first, and then Great Northwest Company, surveyor, trader, and most importantly, map maker. He's been labeled North America's greatest land geographer, and there's good reason to say that. The Astor expedition, 1810, came by sea, came by land. The one that came by land had problems. When the Astor group went back in 1812, one of their members, in taking a route that seemed a little bit easier, discovers a wagon path over the Continental Divide, so-called South Pass, and it will later become the basis for the Oregon Trail. Charles Wilkes, 1841. He is the Cook of the 19th century for the United States. The XX, which is an exploring expedition the United States launched that went around the world, and his collection comes back to Washington and becomes the basis for the Smithsonian Institution's collections. In 1841, this is the map of Oregon, and in 1841, as you know, that first big wave of Oregon Trail travelers has just arrived. So here's Wilkes at the beginning of what we might consider the creation of the resettled Oregon. Now, by resettled, I mean this is an area that's already settled. It's being resettled by people from someplace else. You can say that it's an invasion, and in some ways it is. And in other ways, it's a resettlement, meaning these people are going to settle, but they bring with them all of this baggage, and they're going to change the relationships between land and people. And they're going to do it on their terms. And part of that starts with the fur trade. And my cohort.
So in the autumn of 1811, the Northwest Company officer David Thompson, whom you heard Dr. Lang mention earlier, and a team of Northwest Company employees paddled up the Columbia River to retrieve a delivery of trade goods brought across the Athabasca Pass. Among the group was Now Kane, or John Cox, or Old Cox. He's pictured here. Thompson describes him as, quote, a powerful, well-made Sandwich Islander, the Sandwich Islands at the time being another name for the Hawaiian Islands, and also described him as, quote, a prodigy of wit and humor, who had a fascination with learning English. As noted by historian Jack Nesbitt, David Thompson observed with interest Now Kane's observations of the Columbia and its resources. Okay, so hold on a second. Now you're probably thinking, where is he going? Why is he talking about Hawaiians? This is about Oregon history, right? This talk is supposed to focus on the fur trade and how it helped craft the Oregon that we all know and love today. Well, Now Kane is going to be one of the threads that helps us weave this story. First of all, as you can tell from the caption here, if you can't read that, it says Old Cox, Sandwich Islander, present at the death of Captain Cook, which, as we know from Dr. Lang's talk, would be 1779. He connects us with the explorers that Dr. Lang spoke of, for he often related to people that he was present at James Cook's death. Above all this, though, the story is one of global connection. It's connecting the Oregon country to the world and the world to the Oregon country. Well, let's leave Now Kane and Thompson on the Columbia River at the Spokane House and provide some context and the backstory to what brought them there and then what followed. Like Bill, I like old maps, so we're going to use a few of them. Well, first of all, what is the Oregon country? Well, let's use we'll do a quick orientation here. Well, it's an area that was first claimed by 4 countries: Russia, Spain, the United States, and Great Britain, but then was reduced to 2, Great Britain and the United States, through various treaties. And it was really the Anglo-American Treaty of 1818 that roughed it out. You don't have to take notes on this. Like Bill said, there will be no quiz. This is a map from 1846, but it really gives you an idea of where that area is. And that's largely, okay, the pointer's not quite working, but the yellow block up above, that Oregon, Washington State, and up into British Columbia there. So in this treaty, Britain and the United States agreed to jointly occupy this area for 10 years, and this was later extended, and it also included free navigation throughout. So just think about that for a minute. This large block of land agreed between these 2 countries to jointly occupy that. Can you picture that? Can we conceive of that? I have a hard time thinking about what that would mean today. I'm going to pull up another map here. This is the Charles Wilkes map that Dr. Lang spoke of earlier. And we're going to use this kind of throughout. I have outlined the Columbia River here. But during the fur trade era, roughly, the Oregon country, which also, as you can see here, is called, referred to as the Oregon Territory. The Hudson's Bay Company called it the Columbia Department, part of it being the Columbia District. You don't need to worry about that. But the area that we're speaking of today was roughly bounded on the east by the crest of the Rocky Mountains, and that's per the Louisiana Purchase. You can see that double up line there. To the south, the 42nd parallel north, per the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819 between the United States and Spain. That is currently the border between Oregon and California. To the west, well, that was pretty easy. That was the Pacific coast. But for the Hudson's Bay Company, it also included Hawaii. And to the north, way up there at the top, you see a double line up there, 5440. We've all heard of 5440 probably from our American history, right? 5440 or fight. Well, this north latitude was established per the Russo-American Treaty of 1824 and also a convention, Anglo-Russian Convention. So we have this area here bounded by these political boundaries largely is what is consisting of what represented the Oregon country at the time. Now, following the War of 1812, the boundary to the east, you can see bounding the United States and British interests. Coming in there, the pink and green line, that was the boundary was established at the 49th parallel, right? Coming across, but it stopped at the crest of the Rocky Mountains. So it would be negotiated where that boundary would fall. Where would that fall? In the Oregon country. Could not be resolved at the time, so it was jointly occupied. And what is the spinal column really of the Oregon country? Well, it's here in blue, the line in blue, the Columbia River, and that's the main branch, not to mention all of its many tributaries. So the first EuroAmericans to capitalize, and pun intended there, on the vast resources of the Oregon country, noted by the explorers, were the commercial operators, those who were coming here to seek a profit. Now, the Euro-American caveat I added because, as we learned from Dr. Lewis's talk at the first session of Oregon History 101, Native peoples had long established trade routes throughout the Oregon country. And I chose this map here to use. You can see some of these rough circles behind in the Wilkes map, and these were done based on the Euro-American perceptions of where some of the native areas were. And the native trade routes and networks centered on areas including the Dalles, Kettle Falls, Willamette Falls, and the mouth of the Columbia River. So who were these commercial operators? Well, they were fur companies, fur trading, fur trapping companies. What was it they were after? Furs, and in particular, the beaver. That's right. What drove this desire for beaver skins, for beaver pelts? Fashion. Yes, it was all about fashion. It was fashionable in Europe and other places for the beaver hat, the beaver collar, and the use of the beaver fur. So it was driven by fashion. So the Northwest Company was a Montreal-based company that had roots back to the 1770s. Although their rival, which was the Hudson's Bay Company, possessed a monopoly on the trade in the areas that drained into the Hudson's Bay, known as Rupert's Land, by the early 19th century, the the Northwest Company saw some potential out here in the west, kind of under and beyond the Hudson Bay Company's areas. They saw a potential for profit out there and started moving in that way. So what was their goal? Well, as you can see from above here, what was their goal? Here it is in their own words, and you can see this illustrated above. The company's further design has been to explore the whole country to the west of the Rocky Mountains and to form upon the great river Columbia a grand establishment for the trade of the adjacent country. So under the intrepid David Thompson, the Northwest Company sought a route into this area from the northeast. So you see them coming in then from the northeast and down. They established forts on the west side of the Rocky Mountains that avoided conflicts with the native peoples, including the Blackfeet and other tribes that understandably were hostile to their presence. So the strategy behind locating these forts was not military. These were not military forts. It was commercial. They maximized the access to the areas where these fur-bearing animals lived. So this is the world into which Naokane was entering with David Thompson, as we discussed earlier. But however, the Northwest Company was not alone in this area. There was competition. Dun, dun, dun. Competition was from the Americans, specifically John Jacob Astor's Pacific Fur Company. Now, only twice during the fur trade era did Americans seriously challenge the British fur companies in the Oregon country, and this was the first. So Astor had been inspired by very close dealings with the Northwest Company earlier, and he saw value in a Columbia River hub for a global fur trade, connecting the Oregon country through a network that included New York City, the Hawaiian Islands, Russian Alaska, China, of course, and Hawaii. He hired former Northwest Company employees and other French Canadians to establish it. So he's using some of these British citizens, and in many cases, or actually used more British citizens than American citizens. Something historian Richard Somerset Mackey calls, quote, a mercenary workforce of the Canadian fur trade. So that's who's coming out here. They were divided into two groups, as Dr. Lang mentioned. One traveled by sea on the Tonkin, and one by land as the Astor Expedition under Wilson Price Hunt. Prior to its arrival on the Columbia River, though, the Tonkin stopped in the Hawaiian Islands in 1811. Through an agreement there with King Kamehameha for contract, they obtained contract workers and a royal observer. That royal observer was Naokane. So to make a long story short, commercially, the Pacific Fur Company was, quote, an unqualified disaster. Astoria was established as the first fur trading post by an American company on the west coast of North America, but it was very short-lived. Now, these Astorians met with many challenges. We don't have the time to go into all of them, but they lost. There was a loss of the Tonkin under one of history's most accurately named captains, I think, Jonathan Thorne, represented his personality well. That was lost up above trading up the coast. Is it Clayoquot Sound, I believe? Other challenges that they had: tardy and lost supply ships. Those that were sailing out to provide them either didn't show up or got lost. A poor quality of trade items. They're lamenting what Astor is sending them out to trade. There is no interest in these items whatsoever. They're really poor quality trash, I believe is what one of them called them. They lost 61 men, a significant number of men. And also they suffered from direct, almost side-by-side competition with the Northwest Company, as you can kind of see here, with the various forts. The blue being the Hudson's Bay, or the blue being the Pacific Fur Company's forts, and the red being the Northwest Company's. So then another point of conflict was the War of 1812. At this point, Astoria and the Pacific Fur Company assets were sold to the Northwest Company in 1813, and the Pacific Fur Company ceased to exist out here in the Oregon country. However, it did make contributions. As Dr. Lang mentioned, it opened up to the fur trade, the South Pass across the Rocky Mountains. And it was David Stewart who announced prophetically that, quote, a journey across the continent might be performed with a wagon. Now, this is in the 18 teens, so he's certainly being looking forward a bit. The Pacific Fur Company also introduced Hawaiian Islanders to the land-based fur trade. Also extended the fur trade into the Willamette Valley and familiarized the fur company employees with the area. As a side note, you'll see down here below, you can kind of get an idea of where you can see Astoria there on the coast. Down below the two posts, you have Wallace House of the Pacific Fur Company and the Willamette Post of the Northwest Company. Several Pacific Fur Company employees would later settle in the Willamette Valley's French Prairie area in Champoeg, along with others from the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company. So, here you have the lay of the land, the lay of the fur trade land in the Oregon country after 1813. As you can see, it's all about the Northwest Company. In their words, quote, we have established a colony of British subjects on the Columbia River for the purpose of carrying on the trade with China. Now, the Hudson's Bay Company starts sniffing around a little bit up there in the northeast. And you see out on the coast, the American merchants, the Boston merchants that Dr. Lang mentioned, continue to dominate the coastal trade. That's the blue line out there. Now, the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company are not in this area, but further to the east. This is a time of great conflict between those two organizations. But you do see the addition of several key forts at this time, including one right there, Fort Nez Perce, which really connected the company into those interior lands. And then you also have the development of these trails, these brigades that connected these posts, not only to the coast, but also to the Northwest Company's trading posts further to the east. So to summarize, the Northwest Company's strategy was to increase profit in this area by extending the fur trade to new areas, specifically in the Snake River area with the yellow lines there, and then down into the Willamette Valley and those areas south of the Columbia River through a series of gateway forts. These forts that are connected, they're networked by trade routes utilizing the Columbia River, its tributaries, and some of those land-based trails and trade networks that had already been established by native peoples. Also by sending brigades from these strategically located forts into the fur-rich areas to trap furs. So if there's one thing I really would like to emphasize, the fur trade in the Oregon country was not the passive fur trade that you might think of, somebody sitting at a desk somewhere, oh, hum-de-dum-de-dum, bringing in furs, people bringing in furs to trade with a trader who's a passive person at a desk. It was not. The fur trade was very active. These companies are taking brigades and they're going out and they're actively trapping throughout these areas, these large parties that would go out and actively trap. They would not sit back and wait for furs to be brought to them. So despite their efforts, it was not a profitable venture. They had this idea of what was called their China venture. So through a trade license with the British East India Company, and then later when that failed, through agreements with American flagged vessels of taking those furs out and trading them, it just never came to fruition. They were not able to profit at all. And then based on some other activities going on back further in the east, the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company merged in 1821. So you can imagine two of these companies that really hated each other, worked against each other, actively fought in battles against each other at times, merging. I'm sure that would have been quite a challenge. But the resulting organization retained the name Hudson's Bay Company, and it combined the strengths of both of these organizations. Okay, let's take a look at the Hudson's Bay Company now. At the merger, the HBC had no posts at all west of the Rocky Mountains. And however, they soon acquired an extension to their exclusive license, which had earlier been just the lands that drained into Hudson's Bay. But it was extended to all the way out to include the Pacific coast. As one of the largest corporations in the world at the time, the Hudson's Bay Company had this exclusive license, and this license also included other natural resources. It wasn't just furs. Their charter says, quote, included, quote, a variety of commodities besides furs. So the Hudson's Bay Company had several issues to deal with. One of them was their central question: what to do with this Columbia district? What to do with this area that we've outlined here? Well, the Hudson's Bay Company's governor and committee in London, so this is a London-based group, pondered information they had received from the British government. They did have inside connections there, plus what they learned from Northwest Company and other employees on the ground out in the Oregon country. In 1824, here's what they directed. Quote, we think the trade should be extended into the Snake Country and also along the coast to the northward. So they saw the Oregon country as what one historian has called, quote, a defensive zone for the protection of the interior. So really a barrier to be strengthened and provide profit. So the idea in these lower portions here to create a barrier that helped protect up to the north. New Caledonia was also called that, but those areas there in today's British Columbia that were very, very fur rich compared to those in the Oregon country, which were not as rich. So enter at this point for the Hudson's Bay Company, George Simpson, the company's indefatigable autocratic governor of the Northern District. So Simpson then went about this in three ways. He was going to make this place successful. The old turn a silk purse or turn a sow's ear into a silk purse kind of thing. He was going to make this district profitable. And here's how he went about it relentlessly. First of all, to expand and open up the coastal trade. He wasn't accepting of the earlier American dominance, even though it had started to wane as the sea otters were largely trapped out. He saw wealth and value there. Also, he wanted to strengthen the British presence in the disputed territory. And the disputed territory at this point is the area between the 49th parallel. So if you can imagine that going across, and then the Columbia River, if you could see that lightly outlined there in red going up. So this was the contested area. So he saw the government and the governor and committee recognized that, quote, occupying the soil is the best title. So here's what they started doing. You'll see a lot of these forts coming in now. Some names you may recognize. They center their headquarters and depot at Fort Vancouver, later called, quote, the New York of the West. And they tapped a former Northwest Company leader as the chief factor for the department, Dr. John McLaughlin, pictured here. Now, McLaughlin was a man with a commanding presence and disposition. We could have many, many conversations about him, and there are many quotes and many people who have described him. Here's the description that I like best from the diminutive George Simpson, who met him in the interior as their vessels passed each other in 1826. Such a figure as I should not like to meet in a dark night in one of the by-lanes in the neighborhood of London, dressed in clothes that had once been fashionable, but now covered with 1,000 patches of different colors. His beard would do honor to the chin of a grizzly bear, his face and hands evidently showing that he had not lost much of his time at this toilet. Loaded with arms and his own Herculean dimensions, forming a tout ensemble that would convey a good idea of the highwaymen of former days. Now, Simpson's third strategy was to exploit the region south of the Columbia River while the British still had access to it. This includes the area that we know today as Oregon. But we'll get to that more in a moment. I want to revisit that license to exclusive trade. One of the key things is that it did not affect Americans. So soon, the Hudson's Bay Company had its first and the region's second competition from Americans in the form of Nathaniel Wyeth's Columbia River Fishing and Trading Company. Wyeth was inspired in part by the writings of Hall Kelly in his geographical memoir of Oregon, published in 1830, which was all the rage back in the East and encouraged American settlement in Oregon. I don't want to go into too much detail, time won't permit, but Wyeth's efforts were thwarted in a very gentlemanly fashion by the Hudson's Bay Company, almost as if they took pity on poor Nathaniel. Of interest to us, though, are Wyeth's fort and farm that he established on Sauvie Island, known as Fort William, and Wyeth's post high up on the Snake River, known as Fort Hall. That's the lower one there in blue. Now, although Wyeth's experiment seemed to the Hudson's Bay Company doomed from the start, McLaughlin and the HBC still felt it necessary to set up a competing post to cut off his trade at Fort Hall. So they set up, plus they also add Fort Umpqua here in modern Oregon to facilitate access to the land south of the Columbia. Now, by 1843, the Hudson's Bay Company seemed resolved to accept the 49th parallel north as the boundary that would be negotiated at some point. In anticipation, they established the other post that appeared up there at Fort Victoria, modern-day Victoria, British Columbia. Now, this would become the new headquarters in the depot after the Treaty of 1846 established the boundary we know today between the United States and Canada. And as you probably know, that was a continuation of the 49th parallel. So let's go back and revisit what the Hudson's Bay Company was doing down in the southern part of its Columbia Department, which includes today's Oregon. To do so, I want to switch to a different historic map, one that will help us illustrate the extent of the Hudson's Bay Company activities, because they did go beyond the Oregon country. So here the goal was, I'm going to populate this with the forts. So we have the star as Fort Vancouver, Fort Nez Perce, Fort Boise, Fort Hall. So moving out in that direction, the South Pass, the triangle there is the Americans' encampment. The Americans coming across from the east would have an annual rendezvous in that general vicinity for many years. But here was the Hudson's Bay Company's goal here. The goal was to create a barren buffer zone that was less attractive to Americans, what they called a fur desert. So why leave the furs behind for the Americans? Here's what McLaughlin said, quote, "How much more ought we to endeavor to get all we can out of it when we are certain to be deprived of it?" Here's Simpson. "As we cannot expect to have a more southern boundary than the Columbia in any treaty with the Americans, though we are entitled to it from occupancy, zing, it will be very desirable that the hunters should get as much out of the Snake Country as possible for the next few years." And so the general route followed from Fort Vancouver down and then out and about. Certainly, each year they would take slightly different routes. This is one of the routes to Fort Hall, and then down around where they encountered some of the Americans several years. But all through the area, the John Day River now of eastern Oregon, all through this area south, they would travel. One of the names that's most often associated with the Snake Country brigades is Peter Skeen Ogden. And just as an example, here in yellow is his brigade that he led in 1829 to 1830. He was all over the place. Now that represents just one of those expeditions. Interesting that there was no. They certainly were aware of the boundary there at the 42nd parallel. Interesting. So this and other forays quickly depleted the population of fur-bearing animals. Here's the Hudson's Bay Company's John Work, and I quote, "The country to the southward is ruined so much that little or nothing is to be done with it." Here's another, quote, "Furs are already becoming scarce, and the present supply is obtained by an almost exterminating system of hunting." Now, these are fur trappers and traders recognizing that this is something different. This is not the Hudson's Bay Company's normal pattern of operation. Now, how were these parties a success, these fur brigades? Well, it was very, very different from the American way of trapping. The Hudson's Bay Company brigades were large, 50 to 100, sometimes more, included entire families. So they were community versus individual centered, unlike the Americans. One of the keys was having the women who accompanied them at no pay and at very little recognition. When some of the accounts are made by Ogden and others, they don't even list the women and children that were along with many of these brigades. However, they were so key. Not only did they help prepare meals, but one of the most important roles was cleaning and packing the furs. This allowed the men then to be out and about and trapping. So very, very key, that kind of family, that community or family-centered brigade. Now, this policy did keep, we also had the California brigades, or the Bonaventura parties. So those would come down, basically the route of today's I-5, and go down into the Sacramento River and some other fur-rich areas there, and then head back up. So the idea, again, being getting those furs out of the lands to the south. Now, this policy did keep most Americans away, though some, including Jedediah Smith, did briefly visit and trap the area. I've outlined one of Smith's last expeditions here in the area. He's remembered today, and I mention him because There is a state park. It's a California state park just across the border, but is frequented by Oregonians. And also the site near the mouth of the Umpqua River where his party provoked local tribesmen to the point where all but Smith and 2 others were killed. There's a story of Smith basically ran through the bushes where a rabbit wouldn't go, right? Or the brambles and everything up and connected with some tribal groups who were able to return him or were able to connect him to Fort Vancouver. So he was all over the place, but there weren't really any organized groups that were coming out. He was certainly the exception and not the rule, but Jedediah Smith is a name that resonates in Oregon history. So let's now step back and look briefly at how the Hudson's Bay Company connected the Oregon country to the world. Right, in addition to the Northwest Company's Columbia Brigade route, they also had what was called the York Factory Express, which is populating there. And that connected to the Hudson's Bay Company's main headquarters at York Factory on the Hudson's Bay. So you have that transportation corridor opening up there. It connected Fort Vancouver and later also Fort Langley around to York Factory. The coastal trade, you see here being populated in blue, was dominated by the steamer Beaver, plying up and down the coast. This was the first steam-powered vessel on the West Coast. It was sailed to Fort Vancouver where the boilers were installed. It steamed out and never came back again, but certainly plied up and down this coast to focus on that coastal trade. Then you had what we talked about, the California brigades and also the Snake Country brigades trapping out these areas to the south of the Columbia. Then you also had with the smaller of the 2 large arrows there pointing upward, you had a trade that had been established with the Russians further north. So in the Oregon country, the Hudson's Bay Company created a trade, communication, and transportation network centered at Fort Vancouver, there outlined in yellow, and connected to the world. And if you look at this, think of this as something that's centered there at Fort Vancouver. It's like an octopus, hydra kind of thing. All these different areas they were connecting to Fort Vancouver, and Fort Vancouver was connecting to them, and then in turn, Fort Vancouver was being connected to the world. Now, the fur trade also created a very unique culture, one that included people of many different ethnicities and many different backgrounds. This included Naokane, who not only worked for the Pacific Fur Company and the Northwest Company, but also later worked for the Hudson's Bay Company very close to here at Fort Vancouver. And it was while he was at Fort Vancouver that Paul Kane painted the portrait that we saw earlier. Now, this cultural diversity of the fur trade in the Oregon country is, I think it's well described by an observation of George Simpson. And I quote, "Our bateau carried as curious a muster of races and languages as perhaps had ever been congregated within the same compass in any part of the world. Our crew of 10 men contained Iroquois, who spoke their own tongue, a Cree, half-breed of French origin, who appeared to have borrowed his dialect from both his parents, a North Briton, who understood only the Gaelic of his native hills, Canadians, who of course knew French, and Sandwich Islanders, who jabbered a medley of Chinook, English, etc., and their own vernacular jargon. Add to all this that the passengers were natives of England, Scotland, Russia, Canada, and the Hudson's Bay Company's territories, and you have the prettiest congregation of nations, the nicest confusion of tongues that has ever taken place since the days of the Tower of Babel." Now, this fur trade culture combined European, Hawaiian, and American Indian elements and blended these into interracial families, often through its unique blended marriage rite, à la façon du pays, in the fashion of the country. Now, these families and their connections served as the lifeblood of the Hudson's Bay Company's success in the Oregon country, and also helped establish early Oregon communities in areas including French Prairie, Champoeg, and many of the towns around that area. Now, rather than the idea of the independent, self-sufficient mountain man, the Robert Redford as Jeremiah Johnson, is an icon of the American fur trade, that's okay west of the Rocky Mountains and south of the 49th parallel. However, in the Oregon country, the icon of the British fur trade is the interracial family. Now, this role of family in the fur trade was best described by Chief Factor James Douglas, writing from Fort Vancouver, when he noted that, quote, "To any other being, the vapid monotony of an inland trading post would be perfectly unsufferable, while habit makes it familiar to us, softened as it is by the many tender ties which find a way to the heart." So, what is the legacy of the fur trade in Oregon? How did it help the Oregon that we all know today? Well, first, it connected and instilled Euro-American culture here, moving it from observer to participant. In doing so, connected Oregon to the rest of the world. So you have here's an 1811 map showing, and I've added the routes here. The star being up in the Oregon country, you have trading going on there. You have the furs going out from Fort Vancouver, but it wasn't just furs and things that were going out. You have items coming out to the Sandwich Islands. You have them then going around and connecting with London. Now you'll see the black line on the side there. That's kind of representing this unofficial, almost black market trade that was going on between the Sandwich Islands and China. Black market maybe mostly to the Hudson's Bay Company because they did not have their exclusive trade rights did not include China. That was the area of of one of their rivals. So, but what did you have going back and forth? There were tons of different items. Unlike the Northwest Company, it wasn't just about furs going out. There were a number of things. You had exports, we'll get to in a minute here. Not only were there furs, salmon was being exported. You have lumber being exported, grain being exported. Those in the top row there. But on the bottom left there, you have items that were coming into the Oregon country from the Hawaiian Islands, hogs, and also coral. And there's a piece of coral that was found archaeologically at Fort Vancouver. It was brought in to help with utilized in mortar in some of the construction, for instance. You have coffee coming in not only from the Hawaiian Islands, but also from Cuba, from Central America, through London. You have trade beads from Eastern Europe. You have those necessities of fashion and culture, including early hair gel here called bear grease. You can see this bear's grease container here, again found archaeologically at Fort Vancouver, along with the Queen's China, spode, was used. And being an Oregonian, I can't neglect to put a bottle of beer. We have a bottle here of Reed's IPA, which was imported from England to Oregon as well. So you have all sorts of these trade items that are going back and forth and connecting Oregon to this global marketplace. Now, another legacy of the fur trade is the focus on resource extraction and agriculture as a key to economic growth and profit here in Oregon. So to get a grasp of how the fur trade affected the population of fur-bearing animals, here's a graphic based on data compiled by James Gibson. What I have here in green, if you can see it, these are the total number of furs collected from the broader Columbia Department from 1826 through 1846. Significant number, huh? You see a peak there in about 1839. But what I want you to look at the numbers, or look at the graph in red there. The red are the total furs from the Columbia District. This is everything south of Fort Colville and Fort Nisqually, including most of today's Oregon. It also has a peak in 1839, but you see a general decline in the total amount over time. So in 1826, over half, about 56% of the furs that were brought in came from this area, but you have by 1846, only a quarter, 25% of those that were brought in. Here's George Simpson's comment. It shows, quote, "A gradual decline of the fur-bearing race, which is in our immediate neighborhood, amounts to extinction." Now, the blue line here is the total number of beaver specifically trapped in this same Columbia district, so the same area that includes modern-day Oregon. And what you see there is a continual decline as the species was virtually trapped out. Now, Hudson's Bay Company was aware of this. This was part of their plan. Simpson, again referring to these districts in modern-day Oregon, says, quote, "The returns are rapidly declining owing to the very close manner in which this country has been hunted. This is the natural result of the exertions that have been made to prosecute this trade with vigor, with the double object of benefiting by immediate results and of rendering the country less inviting to the numerous United States trapping parties who formerly threatened to overrun the whole of the accessible country on the west side of the Rocky Mountains." End quote. So what did they do? Well, like any business worth its salt, they diversified. So they identified what they could do to subsidize the fur trade. What did they do? Well, they looked at salmon exports. Columbia River salted salmon sold really well in the Sandwich Islands, they found out. In fact, it was valued so much that it was included into the native diet. Has anyone here ever heard of or tasted lomi lomi salmon before? Yeah. Well, salmon are not indigenous to the Hawaiian Islands. That all came from the Oregon country. But it wasn't just the Hawaiian Islands. Lima, Valparaiso, Linton, Manila, and London, there was a market for salmon. From 60 barrels exported in 1830 to 895 barrels in 1842. Now, what was another a way that they diversified? Lumber exports. So really that history, that connection to timber and lumber dates back to at least to the fur trade era. In 1827, McLaughlin had begun construction of a water-powered sawmill just below today's 205 bridge on the Washington state side, and asked one of the ship captains to inquire about the market for lumber in the Hawaiian Islands. This mill was the first commercial logging operation on the west coast of North America, and you know who it primarily employed? Hawaiian Islanders in the cutting and loading of lumber for shipment. It's interesting because the large market for this was Oahu. It was the Hawaiian Islands. And what was Simpson's goal here? Domination. As he said, quote, "We hope to glut the market so completely as to make the lumber trade a losing business to the Americans, which would prevent their following it up and in due time give us the entire command thereof." Shrewd business fellow, that George Simpson, huh? So the Hudson's Bay Company dominated the lumber exports by 1838, but American competition increased in the 1840s, and the Fort Vancouver mill was rented to an American in 1849 after a new mill was established up at Fort Victoria. So what was another way that the Hudson's Bay Company diversified? Well, the key to George Simpson's plan to squeeze profit out of the Oregon country was to have the posts self-sufficient so that they wouldn't have to import and have the costs of those items that have to be imported to feed them. So and the key to that self-sufficiency was agriculture. So at Fort Vancouver, at Fort Vancouver, there were more personnel and space that went into agriculture than any other endeavor, including the fur trade. In 1829, they had 120 acres cultivated there. By 1846, there were 1,420 acres cultivated, with all sorts of orchard crops, field crops, and garden crops, an array of livestock, a dairy, as I mentioned, on Sauvie Island. The work was mostly done by local native peoples and Hawaiian Islanders. Now, the yield was significant. It was the agricultural propensity of the land that some of the explorers had spoken of. They grew from 17 cattle in 1824 to just under 2,000 cattle at Fort Vancouver in 1846. and from 12 bushels of wheat in 1826 to over 5,000 just 20 years later. So this allowed not only for self-sufficiency in feeding its own posts, but also there was a surplus. And what did the Hudson's Bay Company do with this surplus? They sold it. They sold it to these Americans who were beginning to come across the Oregon Trail. They also entered into an agreement with a Russian-American company and provided them with grains and agricultural products in return for permission to access some of the lands in Russian America. Here's Dr. McLaughlin on the farm at Fort Vancouver. And I quote, "The farm has enabled us to dispense with imported provisions for the maintenance of our shipping and establishments, whereas without the farm, it would have been necessary to import such provisions at an expense that the trade could not afford." So a third legacy of the fur trade is that it laid the groundwork for key political names, boundaries, cities, and transportation corridors that we know in Oregon today. So here is a blow-up of the Oregon we know today from the Wilkes map. And here we have supplanted a modern-day map over the top of it. So right away, what are some of the connections that we can see to the fur trade era? Well, they may be hard to make out, but there's some of these names that pop up. Communities, Astoria, the Dalles. The Dalles was a Canadian-French term for rapids flowing swiftly through a narrow and high-sided channel. Rivers and streams, you have the John Day River. Actually, you have the John Day Rivers. There are two John Day Rivers in Oregon, right? One near Astoria, and the other one that we are more familiar with further to the east. Both of them are named after John Day, a Virginian hunter from the Astor Overland Party. If you don't know his story, it's quite an interesting one. Basically, it's named after him because he was found naked and robbed at the mouth of that river, and it so resonated with his fellows in the fur trade that they named that river after him. Be interesting to see a wayside exhibit, how that would be portrayed there. You have the Owyhee River. Ogden in 1826 calls it the Owyhee or Sandwich Island River, quote, "so called owing to the two of them murdered by Snake Indians in 1819. You have the Malheur River. Here's Ogden again, quote, "we encamped on River Au Malheur, the unfortunate river, so called on account of property and furs having been hid here formerly, discovered and stolen by natives." You have the Deschutes River. I'll blow through some of these. Deschutes River, the Crooked River, from a British map in 1824. The Rogue River, named according to Father Blanchet, the name is Les Coquins, the Rogues, and La River aux Coquins, or the River of the Rogues. You have the Mackenzie River, named in 1814 after Donald Mackenzie, nicknamed Perpetual Motion Mackenzie, and I think people could probably say that name might apply to sections of that river as well. Even the Blue Mountains, the Northwest Company's David Thompson calls them such in a journal as early as 1811. But there are other smaller regional features. You have Sauve's Island, named for Laurent Sauve, a Hudson's Bay Company employee who worked there at the dairy. The town of Gervais, named for the fur trade employee and French Prairie resident Joseph Gervais, who also, according to some, named the Pudding River. And then, of course, you have the name McLaughlin. The name McLaughlin is throughout the area. Businesses, some of you may have driven on McLaughlin Boulevard even to get here this evening. One of the most notable features named McLaughlin is right down below here, Mount McLaughlin. It was first noted in a map of 1838 with this name. Was also known as Mount Pitt, but in 1905 the Oregon legislature restored the name Mount McLaughlin to honor the doctor. And as many of you may know, John McLaughlin is also one of Oregon's two representatives in the National Statuary Hall collection in the U.S. Capitol. And there is currently a 10-person commission that's studying the idea of replacing either McLaughlin or Reverend Jason Lee as one of these figures. There was a public meeting this morning. I'll be interested in reading the paper tomorrow to see how the public meeting fared today. It'll be interesting to see if McLaughlin will continue to represent Oregon's fur trade era in Washington, D.C. But there are other connections on the map as well. Let's take a look. Some of the fur trade routes, such as the HBC's California Brigades going north and south there, and the Snake Country expeditions. Those provided access to additional resources and connected the posts, but also, as they do today, they open up corridors of travel for Americans, right? So you have a couple of those that are roughly in parts the same routes today as they were then. You have portions of I-5 coming up and down. You have 84 going out and across. How many of you here immigrated to Oregon through one of these transportation routes? Yeah, okay. Some of you did. I know certainly my wife and I did. So in closing, the fur trade had a huge influence on the development of what we know today as our state, the state of Oregon. Utilizing the information from the earlier explorers and building upon and then supplanting the tribal trade centers and networks, the fur trade connected and then cemented the connection of the Oregon country to the world, taking us from the role of observers of the Oregon country through the explorers to those who are really actively participants in it. And how do they do that? Through commerce and trade, primarily. The fur trade also established natural resource extraction and agriculture as a key to profit and growth here. Harvesting natural resources such as timber and salmon continue to be an economic driver in Oregon today. The fur trade also helped define our Oregon today, not only through the names that we tossed out earlier here, communities, but there are also streets, mountains, rivers, and numerous other resources, but also opened and popularized major transportation corridors that, as we just established seconds ago, continue to connect Oregonians to the country and to the world. Thank you.